Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the virtual home of Princeton Public Library here on Zoom. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the Adult Programming Manager at Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to host tonight's Library and Labyrinth live stream author event for the recent release of the memoir, Cokey, A Life Well Lived. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with Labyrinth Books, and I would like to thank Dorothea Malmolti for her support, not only for this event, but for dozens and dozens of other events this past year and over the years. We are fortunate to have such a wonderful indie bookstore in the midst of downtown Princeton. I would also like to thank Anne Reeves, who is online with us tonight, as she was instrumental in making this event happen tonight. Thank you, Anne. A few housekeeping items. If you'd like to buy the book, it is available from Labyrinth Books. The link is in the chat, but you can also just stop by in person. I should note that this event is also being recorded, and it will go up on the libraries and Labyrinth YouTube channels within a few days from now. So if you have friends and family that you could not be here tonight, you can have them check there, and so they can watch the replay of this. So tonight we will hear about the extraordinary life and legacy of the legendary trailblazing journalist, Cokie Roberts. It's going to be via a conversation between Steve Roberts, her loving husband of 53 years, and Jack Hartman, her grandson who attends Princeton University. Through her visibility and celebrity, Cokie Roberts was an inspiration and a role model for innumerable women and girls. A fixture on the national television and radio for more than 40 years, she also wrote 5 best-selling books focusing on the role of women in American history. Cokey had many roles in her lifetime: daughter, wife, mother, journalist, advocate, historian. Moreover, Cokey was also friends with many in our local community of Princeton via her sister, Barbara Boggs Sigmund, who was the mayor of the borough of Princeton in New Jersey here from 1983 to 1990. So at this time, I would like to bring our guests on screen and have them take the conversation away. So up first is Jack Hartman and also Stephen Roberts. I'll bring them both on together. So Jack is a sophomore, as I said, at Princeton University, pursuing a Bachelor of Arts degree in history with a certificate in history and practice of diplomacy. He has an interest in domestic politics, international relations, and finance. Stephen Roberts has been a journalist for more than 50 years. He is the author of My Father's Houses and From This Day Forward, co-written with Cokey. He is a chief political analyst for the ABC radio network, a professor of journalism and politics at George Washington University, and a nationally syndicated columnist, as well as many other accolades. The biography for Stephen could go on for quite a while, but I think we want to turn the conversation over now to Cokey and to this book and to this wonderful memoir that you've written to keep her legacy alive. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone.
Go ahead, Jack.
Fair enough. So I suppose, given that we have so much kind of richness in front of us, and there are so many different ways that we could begin today, I guess the first question that I would ask is why did you want to write this book, and what did you hope to gain from writing it?
Well, a lot of people have asked me that, Jack. And by the way, thanks to the whole Princeton library and to the bookstore. And as you mentioned, our family has long connections to Princeton. Jack, only the latest example of it. I'll tell you that after Cokey died, Jack, I gave a eulogy, as you remember, at the National Cathedral. You were part of that funeral. You read one of the lessons, and you remember that the stories I told were they were just stories about her life. And I got this enormous reaction to it of people wanting to hear more stories, and really that gave me the idea to do the book. That there were lessons here in her life, and there were really 2 lessons. One was the public Cokey that so many of our listeners tonight know well. They saw her on TV, listened to her on radio for 40 years. And particularly for young women, Jack, she was such a role model. I talked to so many young women who told me in one form or another, I would watch Cokey on TV, or my mother would make me watch Cokey on TV or listen to on the radio. And I would think, I can be that smart. I can be that strong. I can be myself. And that was the public side of your grandmother. An enormous inspiration to many people. But as you know, because you lived with her for so long, there was a private side to Cokey, and she did something good for somebody else every single day. She lived the gospel, Jack, and she was a believing Catholic, as you well know, and it helped shape her view of the world in a profound way. And sometimes that generosity of spirit was directed to her grandchildren, sometimes to her children, sometimes to many other people. And as I did the book, I realized that yes, the public Cokey was very inspirational and very important, but not everybody can be a TV star, right? Not everybody can be on the radio. Everybody can be a good person. Everybody can learn something from Cokey's life about how you live your life every day in ordinary, small ways, being a good friend and a good neighbor and a good grandmother. And in many ways, I thought that was even more important than the public Cokey, because everybody can learn something from that. And that's really why I did it.
Wonderful. And so you mentioned really wanting to bring out that personal side of Cokey, kind of in addition to what everyone was able to see on ABC or here on NPR. And obviously, unfortunately, we're not able to be in person here in Princeton tonight, but I assume there is a very strong Princeton contingent in the audience. And so can you talk a little bit about her connections to the town and kind of what the town meant to her and to her family around her?
Yeah, well, there were a great many connections. And in some ways, one of the connections started even before Cokey and I met. A lot of people don't know this, but of course, her sister Barbara was mayor for 7 years, as was mentioned. But Barbara's husband, Paul Sigmund, was a longtime politics professor at Princeton. That's how Barbara got to Princeton, was because she married Paul. But back in 1962, Jack, Paul Sigmund, your uncle, was a young teaching fellow at Harvard. And I took my Gov 1 class with Paul Sigmund at Harvard. So we actually met the two sisters. We actually met before either one of us met the two sisters we married a few years later. And then Paul went off to Princeton, became a tenured professor, a very distinguished professor in the politics department. Barbara joined him. They got married in Princeton. We visited them many, many times. You had 3 boy cousins in Princeton, or I guess they're second cousins. They're older than you. But we were there all the time. And then your mother decides to apply to Princeton. And one of the main reasons your mother applied to Princeton was because of your Aunt Barbara. And Barbara had 3 sons and never had a daughter. And so the notion of your mom going to Princeton was very important, both to your mother and to your aunt. And there's 2 wonderful stories about leaving your mother off at Princeton, and in the fall of 1988. And we were staying with Barbara and Paul. They had this wonderful old house on Evelyn Place, right off Nassau Street. And so we were getting ready to go to dinner, and your mother calls upstairs and says, "Aunt Barbara, do you have a pair of stockings I can borrow?" And your Aunt Barbara says, "Finally, a girl child in my house asking for a pair of stockings. I've waited 20 years for this." And of course, your mother feels that way too, since she had just 3 boys as well. But the next day we were leaving your mom on campus, and she was always a very placid, I'm not placid, she was a very well-meaning child and never any problems and very loyal, very loving. And yet we stayed too long. We made a big mistake. We stayed too long. And she was really eager for us to leave. And so she basically just waved us goodbye and said, we stay through lunch. Never stay through lunch when you're dropping a child off at college. And so we waved goodbye, and we're feeling kind of bruised. I mean, he was this loving child of ours, just sort of, not a tear, not a blink. She couldn't wait for us to leave. So Cokey and I are leaving the Princeton campus, and we're feeling, as I say, a little bruised. And we see a young woman weeping into the arms of her parents as they're leaving. And Cokey turns to me and says, now there's a satisfying child. Of course, Becca was there at Princeton, your mom, for 4 years. One of her major activities was singing. She sang with a wonderful women's group called the Digressions, and they used to do arch singing all the time. That great Princeton tradition on football Saturdays, primarily of singing under the arches of the wonderful buildings with the great acoustics. And your grandmother and I spent many Saturday nights following your mother around as groupies around the Princeton campus as she sang with her group. And so there were just a great many ways. And but the final poignant, and it's not the final one, but one of the things that attached us to Princeton when your Aunt Barbara got sick during your mother's junior year, and with her what proved to be a fatal illness. She had had cancer years before, but then it recurred. And so your mother was just a junior at Princeton, and yet she insisted on helping to care for your aunt through her final illness. And it's not the way you normally want someone to spend their junior year in college, but your mother kept saying, I'm a Boggs woman. This is what I'm supposed to do. So we have a great many wonderful ties. And of course, then when you decided to go to Princeton and were accepted and decided to go, it was just one more link in a wonderful chain.
For sure. And I suppose going a little bit deeper on that, obviously, Barbara is a figure that's probably known to our Princeton audience here, obviously being mayor of the town, but maybe not as well known as kind of part of Cokey's life to the wider national audience that this book will reach. Is there anything that you wanted to explicitly include about the relationship in the book? Anything that you felt was really important to include that really painted the picture of who Cokey was?
Well, Cokey and Barbara had a very close relationship. Barbara was 3 years older. And one of the connections they had, Jack, was through the Sacred Heart Order, the Order of Nuns that trained them both. And actually, Barbara's first job when she got to Princeton, when she married Paul, was at Stewart Hall, at the Sacred Heart School there in Princeton. And so they were taught by many of the same nuns. It was a powerful connection that both women shared. And Cokey, in fact, at one point dedicated one of her books to the nuns of the Sacred Heart and said they took girls seriously in the 1950s, which was not very, very common. I do think that, in some ways, Cokey lived the life that Barbara had hoped for. Barbara ran twice for political office beyond Princeton. She ran for nomination for the U.S. Senate, was defeated by Frank Lautenberg, and then ran for Democratic nomination for governor, was defeated by Jim Florio. But Barbara poured this enormous talent and enormous energy and enormous vitality into being mayor of Princeton. And that's why today people still remember her with such fondness and such affection. I was just talking yesterday to a former student of mine named Bill Baroni, who represented Hamilton Township in the state legislature outside of Princeton. And he was saying, even now, people talk to him all the time about your Aunt Barbara. So Princeton, even though there were disappointments in Barbara's life about not moving on to the national stage, Princeton was the beneficiary in a way of her disappointments because they got all of Barbara, which was a lot.
Well, you mentioned briefly how Barbara was in office and obviously ran for higher office, and Cokey famously came from a family of many office holders. Obviously, her parents, both congressmen, her father, a potential Speaker of the House, had he not tragically died in a plane crash, her brother, another unsuccessful candidate for the House. Do you think that Cokey ever regretted not running for office or wished that she had done so herself kind of looking back on her career?
The way she put it was that she was semi-guilty. Because one of the things that Cokey believed strongly was that journalism was public service. And I think she was right about that. And as you point out, of the 5 people in that nuclear family, your great-grandparents, Hale and Lindy, Barbara, and Cokey, and their brother Tommy, Cokey was the only one of the 5 who never ran for Congress. As Cokey also pointed out, the only one in the family who never lost an election was her mother. But they were, you know, and Cokey had great affection for Princeton and admired Barbara's work there. To this day, the women's space is an important institution that Cokey was always a strong supporter of, something that Barbara did as a refuge for abused women. And it was and I think Cokey in another life would have run for office, Jack, but she, you know, she said, well, I became a journalist because I married one. And that Stephen was going to be a journalist from the time I was 10 or 12, which is true. I'm also a native of New Jersey, as you know, from Bayonne, New Jersey. And that was true. I was headed for that kind of career. And so when we met each other and married, she realized she couldn't run for office and be married to a journalist, or it would be very awkward. So, but late in her life, last 15, 17 years of her life, she quit her job as the anchor of the ABC Sunday program. And one of the main reasons she did, Jack, was so that she could be freer under the ethics rules of ABC to be more directly an advocate for issues she cared about. And like her sister Barbara, what they had very much in common was this focus on the welfare and rights of women as a major part of their public focus and priorities. And so she joined the board of an organization called Save the Children and went around the world learning about programs that they had in various countries, advocating for them. She was their spokesman. And that, I think, filled in a piece that was left open there. Because as you point out, not only was their Barbara and Cokey's parents, both members of Congress, their father spent 30 years in the Congress, their mother 18. As you know, we don't believe in term limits in our family. But going back to the earliest days, your twin brother is named Claiborne Hartman. And Claiborne, the first Claiborne came to America in 1620. The first Claiborne elected to the Congress was elected in 1797. There was a fellow at the Brookings Institution, Steve Hess, who did a book, Jack, trying to rate different families in American history according to the different offices they held, and he gave a numerical value to each office. And so the original book, number 1 were the Roosevelts, number 2 were the Kennedys, number 3 were the Claibornes, your mom's family. Cokey's middle name was Claiborne. Your great-grandmother was Lindy Claiborne. And as I say, your brother is Claiborne. And so, but you can imagine Cokey doing this. You just hear her, right? She reads the manuscript and says, Steve, to Steve Hess, the author, you have missed 6 members of my family. And she forced him to recalibrate all of his rankings and rewrite the book. And now the Claibornes are number 2 in American history, second only to the Roosevelts. And that's because the Roosevelts had 2 presidents, so we can't compete with them. But so there's a pretty long lineage here. This doesn't start with your great-grandparents. And but, you know, journalism is public service, Jack. I've always felt that, and I think your grandmother did too.
Yeah, I know there may have been a brief period of panic, and a few years ago when Jeb Bush was running for president, the Bushes could have overtaken the Claibornes, but as of now, they can maintain their ranking. Maybe find some younger Claibornes to boost their numbers a little bit. Yeah, maybe I'll have to get my brother into office, but where he wears the name proudly, that's for sure. So I suppose to reset the deck here a little bit and kind of go back to to kind of the beginnings of your relationship. How did you and Cokey meet? And kind of, can you talk a little bit about some of the earliest details that you include in the book?
Well, we were college sweethearts in sort of a very traditional sense. We met, actually, Barbara had something to do with our meeting because we were both got involved in the National Student Association. Barbara had been involved before us. She was 2-3 years older. She was a delegate from Manhattanville, the Catholic Women's College in Westchester County, where that she attended. And so both of us got involved in this organization. And we went to the summer convention in the summer of 1962 at Ohio State University. And Cokey had met my twin brother, a lot of twins in our family, and had met my twin brother, Mark. And the way she always told the story, she looked across the room at this convention and saw someone that looked a whole lot like Mark Roberts, but not quite like Mark Roberts. And she goes over and she sees my name tag and says, Steve Roberts, are you Mark Roberts' brother? And I said, yes. And I looked at her name tag and I said, are you Barbara Boggs' sister? And that's how we met. And fortunately, we realized that our dorms were 12.5 miles apart back in Boston. I was at Harvard, she was at Wellesley. And she actually asked me out in one of our first dates. She was a singer, like your mother. She was a singer all through college, and like your mother, loved women's voices, always wanted to sing just with women, not in mixed choruses. And so she was had a starring role in the junior show at Wellesley, some kind of musical event. And of course, since I was such a big spender, Jack, I took her out afterwards to the Howard Johnsons in Wellesley Village afterwards, a magnificent meal. And that was one of our first dates, but I was a typical jerk. I didn't call again for months. And I had never had a serious girlfriend. And the whole idea sort of baffled me. But also she was Catholic and I was Jewish. And there was sort of the assumption that we could never get around this. And again, there are so many themes here that connect because your Aunt Barbara played yet another role in connecting us, because Barbara at this point had graduated and was working with the National Student Association and was organized a big meeting in Washington on the idea of a domestic Peace Corps. President Kennedy, of course, had created the Foreign Peace Corps. There was a lot of talk there should be a domestic version. And so Barbara organized a big convention here in Washington at American University. And so a whole group of us were supposed to come down to Washington that spring. And I hadn't seen Cokey for months, but we had organized that we would all drive down together in the same car. And so I remember approaching the car parked on a side street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and seeing Cokey through the back window and saying to myself, you idiot, this is the girl. What the hell have you been doing? And we really were together forever after that weekend, but we came down here and lots of folks, a lot of guys were supposed to stay right here at this house where I'm sitting right now, House of Bradley Boulevard, that your great-grandparents bought in 1952 and was Cokey's girlhood home, Barbara's girlhood home. And but it turned out that all the other guys didn't come. So I was the only guy staying here at this house. And the first night I was here, this is a story I've told many times, I was ensconced in Cokey's girlhood room on the second floor here. And I had a terrible cough because I was spending the winter in Boston. You always have a cough in Boston. And I hear a knock on the door. Now, this is 1963, Jack, so I'm figuring it's not Cokey. And in walks your great-grandmother, the future member of Congress, the future ambassador to the Vatican, right? And my future mother-in-law, wearing this off-the-shoulder peach-colored negligee and saying, my darling, you sound terrible. Drink this. At which point, I mean, I was in shock, Jack. I'd never met anybody like this in Bayonne, New Jersey, believe me. And I'm sure what she gave me was 2/3 bourbon at least. And of course, as you know, the joke in the family was I fell in love with Mama first and eventually got around the Cokey, which was, a lot of truth to that. But the next night, there was a fellow who really was in love with Cokey, who went to, of all places, Yale University, a place we can mutually despise. And so he was angling to take her home, but I was staying here, so I had the inside track. So we came, and the next night we stayed up all night talking in a room directly below where I'm sitting right now. And that was the first time, Jack, that we started dimly, tentatively, started to see that there maybe was a path forward, that the stereotypes and prejudices people were trying to impose on us, the labels and the differences that people were emphasizing, were not as important as what we really shared. And that first night, we stayed up all night, you know, and she made some scrambled eggs at 6 o'clock in the morning. Then we got back in the car and drove back to Boston. But that was the real beginning. And that was the spring we fell in love. And that's why the ring I wear, which I still wear, is inscribed Forever Spring. Now that took 4 more years before we were able to fight through. We were very young. We had these religious differences. And my parents in particular were very uneasy about this relationship. And my father wrote me a 5-page single-spaced letter telling me how it could never work. And I wrote him back and I said, well, Dad, there's one difference between us. I'm in love and you're not. And you can imagine when your grandmother and great-grandmother, 2 of the most charming women in American history, both focused on my father and tried to convince him that this was going to work. He didn't have a chance, right? I mean, he was out of the game. And finally, their combined offensive did its work. And he said to me on the eve of the marriage, which happened right here in the yard of this house where I'm sitting. And he said, well, Stephen, it'd be so much easier to oppose this marriage if it wasn't so obvious. She's the perfect girl for you. And then I knew it was going to be okay, Jack.
No, certainly fond memories for you. And obviously faith was a big part of your early relationship, as you mentioned, and you've now gone on to write a book about interfaith marriage and counseled hundreds of interfaith couples on kind of the way forward in that regard. What influence do you think faith had on Cokey, and how do you think it shaped both her personally, professionally, and kind of what she took from that?
Well, it's a good question, Jack, and it was profound, and it had several manifestations. The first and most obvious was that she lived the gospel. She was trained by the nuns at a very young age with one of the most basic adages of any religious tradition: to whom much is given, much is expected. And she actually believed it, and she actually lived it. And I think you can trace so much of her personal generosity and friendship and compassion to it was good works in the world, Jack. It was a mission, and a mission rooted very deeply in her religious faith. Although she shared, because she was trained by women, nuns, her faith always had an edge of bitterness about a resentment about the male domination of the Catholic Church. She used to say, you know, the nuns told us we could grow up to be anything except priests. And there was always a bitter touch to that comment. But she insisted, she said, I am not going to let the male hierarchy drive me from this church. It's my church. I have a personal relationship to God and to Jesus, and I am going to stay, and I'm going to on my own terms. And she was once asked by an interviewer, what's your favorite Sunday morning news show? And she said, Mass, which is what she believed. And she was very open about her faith. The first day she ever worked for ABC, I was told the story by a young producer, was there that morning. And Cokey walks in, and she's in her mid-40s at this point, but she, not intimidated by the fact that she was auditioning for a network TV job, right? And she says to this producer, Mark, there are 3 things you need to know about me. I've been married to the same man for 20 years. I live in the house I grew up in, and I go to church every Sunday. And if you understand those 3 things, we're going to get along fine. And this fellow said to me, Steve, on all the years I've known you both, the only thing that changed was the number of years you were married. Otherwise, it was always the same story. So it guided her in profound ways. And not only in her personal life, but when I mentioned, going around the world and for Save the Children, that was a religious mission. That was a religious calling in a very profound way. But there was another thing that really happened that was really remarkable. Because she was a woman of faith, she took all faith seriously and all religion seriously. And so when we married and we had this understanding that we would raise our children in both faiths, she said, okay, pal, you got to get serious now. And I was raised in a very Jewish family, but in a tribal sense, and not in a ritualistic sense. There are a lot of isms in our family, but Judaism was not one of them. It was Zionism and socialism and politics. And so she said, look, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to do these rituals, because as she pointed out, I kind of knew I was Jewish because of history and culture and the food my grandmother cooked and all of that. She said, if I was going to be part of Judaism, my connection was through ritual. And of course, that was how she practiced Catholicism, going to Mass every week. And so she was the one who insisted that we create these rituals. My mother often said that the first Passover Seder she ever went to was organized by her Catholic daughter-in-law. And she embraced my Jewish heritage with such joy, Jack, and with such enthusiasm. And as some of the folks on this call will know, that at Passover, the book that contains all the stories, the prayers, the legends, is called a Haggadah. And Cokey decided she was going to write her own, mainly one that would be compatible with an interfaith family. And so after we'd been married just a couple of years, she sat about writing a Haggadah. She took pieces from different books. And that was sort of a mimeograph version we used in our Passover Seders for over 30 years. And then folks in the Jewish book world heard about our Haggadah and asked us to publish it. So we were preparing the manuscript for publication. And I looked at it and I thought, well, some of this language needs some freshening. So I started editing it. And your grandmother was furious, Jack. She came to me and said, you can't change a word of that. This is sacred text. We've been using it for a generation. Now, I didn't stay happily married to that woman for 53 years by ignoring those moments, right? Nor did you as a grandson ignore those moments. So when she was serious, she was serious. So I said, okay, dear, write whatever you say. And then she started changing the text. And I said, wait, Cokey, you told me it was sacred. I couldn't change a word. And she said, yes, Stephen, I told you you couldn't change a word. But since I wrote it, I can change it now. We came to a working détente and a diplomatic understanding on this. But two final things on this point. I venture to say, Jack, she is the only daughter of an ambassador to the Vatican to write a Passover Haggadah. I think I'm safe in saying that. But also she was she was so joyous and so forceful in embracing my Judaism that, as you know, she was known as the best Jew in our family. She always pointed out there wasn't a lot of competition for the title. It was a pretty low bar. But the truth is, she also spoke at a great many Jewish events over the years and was a favorite at all these events around the country. And she was actually made a life member of Hadassah, which is a Zionist women's organization that supports healthcare in Israel. So not only was she a daughter of the ambassador of the Vatican who wrote a Haggadah, she also was a life member of Hadassah, which was emblematic of how important faith was to her. And it changed our lives, it changed my life.
Well, certainly wonderful insight into Cokey, kind of the person and a side that I think is not necessarily drawn out as much in what most people know about her, though I guess to pivot to, I guess, how most people will have seen her up to now. How did Cokey become a journalist and why, kind of why and how did that occur?
Well, it's a long story. As I mentioned, she said she became a journalist largely because she married one. And but her first job out of college, she actually worked for a small TV production company and hosted her own TV show. And it was on the local NBC station here in Washington. It was a measure of life in 1966 that it was always just assumed that the guy's job was more important I had been hired on the city staff in the New York Times as a reporter. It was a pretty good job, but her job was at least as good, if not better. And he just decided we were going to move to New York. And she ran into enormous discrimination and doors slammed in her face. Now, this is a woman, Jack, who eventually wrote 5 national best-selling books and was told repeatedly by Newsweek magazine and many other places, we do not hire women to be writers. Think about that. We don't even hire them because there's some genetic disability here that women are not capable of, putting words on paper. It's just astounding when you think about it, but it was true. And it was very depressing to her. And she was very unhappy in those first year or two in New York. But eventually she got a job at a small newsletter. She started writing small stories and she got a taste for journalism. It was just a taste. We moved to California, again, for my job. And she was producing television shows, but for children. But it was a part-time job and she had a lot of time on her hands. And your Uncle Lee had been born and then your mother was born and in California. And she was kind of stuck on a mountaintop in Malibu with 2 little babies and she wanted to get out of there on a more regular basis. So we hit on a scheme. I was the New York Times correspondent and I was being offered all of these opportunities to write because it was the best story in the world. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Southern California, late 60s, early 70s. So we hit on this scheme. The Cokey would do the research for the article, I'd write it, she'd edit it, and would have a double byline. And so we did a number of these stories together, and she herself described it as a one-man journalism school that she went through. But then we moved to Europe, again, for my job, to Athens. And this is the moment that was the real breakthrough. She connected with CBS and said, well, maybe I can do some part-time reporting for you from Athens. And they said, fine. They gave her a tape recorder. And she was very excited about that. That was a mark of she was going to be a real journalist. And we got to Athens for first 2 months. She's putting, your mother was 3, your Uncle Lee was 5, puts them in school, gets the house settled, and she cables CBS and says, I'm ready to do some work for you now. No more than a couple of days later, there was a coup in Cyprus, which was part of my territory. Right-wing generals had deposed the left-wing government, and virtually every reporter from that part of the world went to Cyprus. And then the Turks invaded Cyprus to reverse the coup. Cokey's back in Athens with, her 3-year-old mother and 5-year-old uncle. And she gets a cable from CBS saying, the Turks have invaded Cyprus. Can you file a radio report in 30 minutes? At that moment, think about, this was one of the founding mothers of NPR, one of the great radio voices of her generation, had never done a radio report in her life, never. And so she makes her way down to Reuters, the Reuters office where I had some friends and connections. She cobbles together a piece. 2 days later, the military government in Greece falls. And it's a much bigger story than the coup in Cyprus. Cyprus was a sidelight. Greece is a NATO country, fall of a military government. It's the biggest story in the world that night. And Cokey was virtually the only English language reporter in Athens because the rest of us were all in Cyprus. And so she tells the story about she was downtown in Athens and she hears these horns blaring and people shouting. She realizes it's just been announced that the military government is giving way to a civilian government. And so she holds her tape recorder up, the CBS had given her, and she gets all of the sound of the excitement. And she goes to this flower stall along the side of the main square of Athens. And in those days, technology was pretty rudimentary. And to get audio back to CBS in New York, she had to unscrew the telephone and have these clips that transmitted the audio from her tape recorder to the phone. This guy thinks she's from the CIA. The guy runs this flower stall, screaming at her. And she finally says, calm down, I'll buy a lot of flowers from you when I'm through. She gets the report out. And that night, CBS calls your great-grandmother and says, Mrs. Boggs, do you have a picture of your daughter? And she freaks, said, what's wrong? What's wrong? I said, no, there's nothing wrong. But the only report we have out of Athens, it's the biggest story in the world. It's leading the Walter Cronkite show tonight. But the only report we have is Cokey's radio report. So we're going to run the audio and we want to run her picture next to it. I had no idea that any of this was happening. I was in Cyprus under fire. The next 6, 7, 8 days, Cokey's filing continuously. Biggest story in the world. And the main CBS guy was stuck with me back in Cyprus. So I finally got out of Cyprus. I got back to Athens, and I walked through the door, Jack, and found I was married to a veteran foreign correspondent. And that was really her breakthrough. But still, she was not a full-time reporter. We got back to Washington a few years later, and she was very unhappy about being back. And I found a desk. I was given a desk in the New York Times Bureau. It was my first day back in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. Again, we moved for my job. I saw a young woman next to me who I didn't recognize. I asked her name. I said, "Where'd you used to work?" She said, "National Public Radio." And I said, "Jack, what's that?" Because I had never heard of it before. We had been in existence for 6 years, but for 4 years. For 4 years, we had been in Europe. And so I said, "My God, it sounds like the perfect place for my wife to work. What do I do?" And she said, "Call my friend Nina Totenberg," who to this day is, of course, one of our closest friends, and was then the Supreme Court correspondent and is today. And so the next day I brought Cokey's resume over to NPR. And the rest is history. But there's an important footnote there, Jack, because that was the first moment I saw the old girls network at work, where women could do for each other what men had always done. And 10 years at NPR, and then ABC came calling, and there she was. She was launched. For sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing that insight. I believe we are about to enter the Q&A portion of the program. I don't know if I'm going to turn it over to you to manage the questions.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'll manage the questions, and the questions can be for either Jack or for Stephen. And in fact, one of our first questions from the audience is a question for you, Jack, because I think we're curious about if you could say something about the influence that Cokey had on your life as her grandson, and about your own relationship with her.
Of course. I think the one thing that I would always make a point of in describing my relationship with Cokey is that I was very lucky that I got to do both, quote unquote, and that I did a lot of kind of traditional grandmotherly grandson things. Like I still cook using recipes that probably passed down from her grandparents from Louisiana. Like I got to do kind of things that you would think of, and she was a great cook too. And like that was something that we shared kind of in the kitchen, but also I got to go to the White House, and I got to go to the Library of Congress and meet cool people and go cool places. And like, so I was tremendously lucky and privileged that I had both like a very kind of traditional grandmother-grandson relationship, and then had all this cool stuff that I could do on the side with what Cokey did professionally. And so for that, I think I was really lucky, and that's something that I've always cherished, with kind of that ability to kind of to have both of those things.
Yeah, and it comes through even here on screen, your relationship with your grandfather here. This conversations has been delightful to see your rapport that you have with each other. You can tell the warmth that's in your family for each other, and that's really great. Okay, so one question here, this is for Stephen, is how do you feel that Cokey's Sacred Heart education influenced her life? As you did mention, we do have a Sacred Heart school here in Princeton, Stewart Country Day, and that's where Barbara taught. So obviously had a big influence on both of their lives in some ways, but how do you feel it influenced Cokey's life?
Well, you're absolutely right that Sacred Heart, and Stewart, I'm glad you mentioned Stewart Country Day School. Interestingly, the new head of that school is a sister of a former student of mine. And so the connections continue. But I think it was, I mentioned some of the ways, because girls were taken seriously from a very young age. She really felt confident. She felt that she could do things. Now, I don't think she felt she could do that necessarily in a professional sense, but there's a wonderful story, which involves Barbara. And so the summer before Cokey went to college, Barbara, and Cokey was only 16 because she had skipped grade. And Barbara met a woman named Marcia Burek at one of these student political meetings I've been talking about. And Marcia was a delegate from Wellesley. And so Barbara says to Marcia, well, my little sister is only 16 and she was taught by nuns and she's very shy. Can you imagine Cokey being described as shy? So Marcia agrees to become Cokey's big sister. And she tells me the story about she's looking around, they're having a picnic to meet all the freshmen. And she's looking around for this meek little 16-year-old and in blasts this tornado of energy and took over the picnic because she, you know, she was just her first week of freshman year. But remember, this was fall of 1960s, right before the Kennedy election. She was, you know, knew more about politics than all the rest of the girls put together. But what the connection to the nuns there was that she had the confidence to do that. The nuns had imbued her with that sense of vitality and that sense of you can do anything, as I say, except being a priest. And in fact, there was another Sacred Heart school in Boston called Newton College of the Sacred Heart. It's since been absorbed by Boston College. But a lot of the nuns from Stewart and from Stone Ridge and who taught Barbara and Cokey were at Newton. And early in our relationship, she trotted me out one Sunday afternoon to meet the nuns at Newton College. And it was clear that I was on display there. And if they didn't approve, this relationship was off because she trusted the nuns. She trusted their judgment. And they left her with such a strong sense of, you know, going to a girls' school and being taught by women. That was true, of course, at Wellesley too, but even more profoundly at Sacred Heart. This sense of all of her models of inspiration were women. And so when you think about this, that she wrote 5 books rescuing and reviving the stories of women in history, I mean, it's a direct line. It's a direct line between the training she got from the nuns and her interest in exploring the roles women have played in history.
So, and Ellen Dowling in the chat has also reminded us that we actually have 2 Sacred Heart schools here in Princeton, because we also have the Princeton Academy of the Sacred Home of the Heart, which is an all boys brother school to Stewart. And okay, so we have someone here who's putting in the chat. It's not so much a question as a little anecdote that they have about Cokey from when they were at Wellesley that she thinks Steve might not know about because it was about him. And this is Crystal Chevelle, who knew Cokey at Wellesley, and she's sharing that they were both members of the Wesley Widows.
Wellesley Widows, yes.
Wellesley Widows, an a cappella singing group, and she had a great voice, could take a classic song and rearrange it, and director at that time. And one afternoon during rehearsal, when Cokey was a senior, she did something unusual. She talked about herself, and she told us there was a guy in her life, and she was wondering whether to take him seriously. And that's when Crystal first heard your name, Stephen Roberts, and she said, if she was asking for advice, we didn't give any. We just supported whatever she said. And now she's glad to know how it all turned out in the end by this conversation tonight. Sure. So thank you for joining us, Crystal, and sharing your story of the time that you knew Cokey growing up.
Well, you know, during that period when we were seniors and Cokey was the head of the Widows, and I was working as this part-time reporter for the New York Times. And so our classic Saturdays when we were seniors in college, Cokey would come to Boston and I would come to Cambridge. I would cover like a swim meet or a hockey game, and I would get the princely sum of $5 from the New York Times for covering this. But there was a restaurant in Harvard Square called Cronin's, which had a $1.95 special. So my $5 covered dinner for 2. And then in the evening, I'd follow the Wellesley Widows and wherever they went to sing. So I was a groupie. I was a groupie of the Wellesley Widows, a proud groupie. And Cokey, and I would listen to her because she was the head of the group, so she was the MC. And I knew all of her spiel, all of her jokes, all of her introductions. So it was a pretty good introduction to 53 years of marriage. I learned to listen to Cokey very early on.
Okay, so we have a question here from Ruda Smithson, who wants to know, what do you think Cokey would think about the status of the media today? And this can go for either Jack or Stephen, and also for Steve, what do you think about the status of media today?
Well, I'll let Jack start if he wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I come at this from a slightly different perspective, having a much more limited exposure to media, and then also not working in the industry. But I would say that I am slightly worried about the state of the media today, and that we don't have the kind of titans of the industry that we did, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades ago. And I think that someone like Cokey is that role is kind of beginning to be lost a little bit in kind of what news content and what media is produced. And so I think it's something that it's not necessarily my ocean to speak about. I mean, I'll turn it over for Steve, who has a lot more to say. But I think there is some concern on my end, and I think we could use more people like Cokey in the media moving forward.
Well, I agree with you on that, Jack, because I think that Cokey stood for a set of values. Now, look, even though she came from a very openly Democratic household, right? Everybody knew. Look, in the year, Cokey and I covered Congress together for 8 years, from 78 to 86. She was the NPR correspondent. I was the New York Times correspondent. We commuted together. We covered the same stories. And everybody knew that. And her mother was a member of Congress, right, during those years. And yet she was so scrupulously professional and so scrupulously fair that no one ever accused her of tilting one way or another. And that is a model that I think we miss sometimes in modern journalism. It's a long topic, and I teach a whole course in it, and I'm not going to bore the audience with the syllabus. But I would say one other thing, though, that one positive thing that's happened. Cokey was a pioneer in terms of diversity in the media. When I started in 1964 and got hired by the New York Times, virtually everybody looked like me. A white male, generally straight, Ivy League educated. We represented a very narrow view of the world. And as Cokey came in and so many other women came in, they changed the whole nature for the better of the press corps. And today, it's yet another whole dimension toward diversity with race and ethnicity, and it's so much healthier to have news reported by people who have such a broader view of the world than my contemporaries did. But one of the things that Cokey, particularly in those early years, it was so important to have women reflecting the interests that women had. And she always told the story that I tell in the book. There was a story we were both covering. There was a big budget summit, long forgotten now, but it was important at the time. And so the budget negotiators come out, and the big issue for all the guys was there funding in the bill for a particular missile called the MX missile. And everybody's shouting questions. Is the MX missile in the bill? Funding for the MX missile? And Cokey looks up and says, excuse me, but is there funding for mammogram research mammograms in the bill? And for breast cancer research? And that symbolized the difference, to have someone like Cokey there to ask that question. And that had never been asked previously because that perspective was not reflected. So there are a lot of downsides to the current media, but the growing diversity is a plus.
Great. So we have someone from the audience, Edna, who wants to know if Cokey had ever visited Israel. As a religious Catholic, then, what was her impressions of Israeli society, if she did?
She did visit Israel. When Jack's mother was about 5 or 6, and her brother was about 8. We were still based in Athens, and we did a trip to Israel. And we did it very much as a interfaith family. We took a children's Bible as we traveled the country. We visited sites that were holy to both of our faith traditions, and it was a wonderful trip. And part of what made it so meaningful to her as well as to me, my grandfather, Avram Rogowski, had been a Zionist pioneer in Palestine in the early 20th century. He was a chalutz, as the Hebrew word, and Cokey knew him well. He was alive when we met. and she loved visiting the places and hearing the stories about my grandfather's youth in Israel. But there was one painful footnote there, and I have to be honest about this. When I wrote an article for the New York Times travel section about traveling to Israel with the kids and as an interfaith family. And I must say, I got a wave of very critical mail, almost entirely from Jewish readers, who were very upset that I'd married outside the faith and very upset that I was taking my half-breed children to Israel. And a number of them, I wrote about my grandfather, and I wrote about visiting the places he had lived as a young pioneer. And a number of these writers said, well, your sainted grandfather probably would turn over in his grave knowing you had married this Catholic. And what was so profoundly unfair and painful to me was that toward the end of his life, when he didn't recognize other people, didn't even recognize his own kids, the person he kept asking for was Cokey, because she had been so kind to him. And for people to impose their own prejudices on the reality of our family and the reality of Cokey's affection for my family, it was just very painful. But the trip in the end was a great trip, and Cokey loved being there. It was an important part of her continuing embrace of my traditions and my faith.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up at the end of our hour, unfortunately. This has been just such a great personal conversation, some really great insights, and thank you for sharing, both of you, so freely your life with Cokey, and how special that she was, not only to your family, but really to the rest of the world, and how her legacy will live on. This has just been a great hour. And so Jack, I know we were talking before that got started, you've got papers to write, so we don't want to keep you on here too long. It's coming to the end of term there. And I imagine, Stephen, you're saying that you're very busy with this book tour with multiple events per day, which is great. We're so happy for both of you. And again, we want to remind you, we do have somebody here in the chat that said that they're going to be, this was a wonderful conversation, and that they're going to be at Labyrinth tomorrow to buy the book, because as a woman who moved to Princeton to be with her 2 young grandchildren, she's really appreciating, Steve, what you had said early on about what it means to be a good grandmother. And so your words tonight are touching people in many ways, and that's really wonderful. And Jack, we appreciate you taking time out of writing your papers and being a student to come on here and talk to your grandfather. And Steve, we just want to thank you for making this a personal event for the Princeton community. We'd hope to have you here in person. Of course, the virus had different ideas, but maybe next time you're in town, we can arrange something. Or
I certainly hope so.
And Jack, I think I see a bright future ahead for you. So again, Cokey, A Life Well Lived is at Labyrinth Books. Dorothea, if you're still online, you want to drop the link in there. It can be ordered online and delivered. And if you're local and you go in the store and give the code Roberts at checkout, you'll get your 10% discount, or you can enter Roberts into the checkout link if you're buying online and get a discount. And we encourage you to stay up to date with other author events coming up, both at the library and at Labyrinth. Sometimes we partner, sometimes we do different things, but we always are having lots of wonderful authors come through, and this has been a wonderful way to spend an evening. So thank you to you both. I'm going to log off now. You have any final words?
Just that one of Cokey's girlhood friends said to me, a Sacred Heart girl whose sister was a Sacred Heart nun, still is a Sacred Heart nun, and said to me, I don't want one of those bracelets that says WWJD. I want one of those bracelets that says WWCD. What would Cokey do? And that's my most important message from this book, that everybody can learn something from how Cokey lived her life. And I hope you enjoyed the book.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night.